We tend to believe that unimaginable wealth can solve any problem, silence any threat, and fortify any legacy. Yet the great houses of Europe whisper a far more complicated truth, one carved not into parchment, but into stone that is now cracking under the weight of time. Among these giants, few stories are as startling as that of the Rothschild palaces, estates so extravagant that even the most powerful banking dynasty in modern history could not keep them alive. Their grandeur once stood as proof that the family had conquered the financial world. Their ruins now reveal an irony sharp enough to unsettle anyone who has ever dreamed of limitless success. This is not a tale of mismanagement or bad luck. It is the story of how the very scale of their ambition became the engine of slow, inevitable collapse. The paradox emerged quietly, long before walls began to crumble. What began as monuments to triumph gradually transformed into burdens so immense that even a dynasty with resources beyond national treasuries struggled to sustain them. These palaces required armies of staff, specialized craftsmen, and constant intervention to prevent nature from reclaiming what humanity had forced into perfection. The estates were breathtaking, but they were also living organisms, complex systems demanding relentless resources simply to remain standing. And as Europe shifted socially, politically, and economically, the world in which such colossal homes could survive began to fade like dusk over a long-abandoned garden. Château Rothschild in Boulogne-Billancourt stands as the clearest example of this transformation. Once envisioned as a shimmering architectural crown, it rose from the landscape with a confidence that only a family at the height of its influence could command. Its limestone facades reflected not just wealth, but the certainty that the Rothschild name was anchored permanently at the summit of European society. Yet, as decades passed, the structure began to echo a much darker story. The very features that once made it magnificent, the extensive grounds, ornamental terraces, lavish interiors, and intricate systems that operated behind the scenes, became the same features that sealed its fate. Sustaining such a place demanded not only money, but a social world willing to support palatial living. That world was eroding. The house did not suddenly collapse. Its decline was gradual, almost polite at first, as if the estate itself hesitated to reveal the fragility beneath its grandeur. Rooflines that once appeared eternal developed their first subtle distortions. Gardens designed to impress visiting monarchs began to outgrow their borders, no longer shaped by the hands of dozens of gardeners who once knew every path, every ornamental tree. Within the walls, silence spread where orchestras had once filled entire wings with sound. Bit by bit, the palace shifted from a symbol of dominance to a reminder of how even enormous fortunes can confront limits far beyond financial spreadsheets. What makes this descent so compelling is not the notion that great wealth failed, but how it failed. The Rothschilds did not lose their position in the world. They did not fall into obscurity. Their banking empire continued to flourish, adapting to new eras with the same precision that once built these homes. And yet, the houses, the structures meant to declare their permanence, were the elements they could not save. It wasn't insolvency that dimmed the lights in these halls. It was the shifting tides of culture, law, war, and time itself. As Château Rothschild began its slow transformation from masterpiece to endangered relic, it became more than a building. It became a warning carved in stone, a paradox made tangible. And it set the stage for the entire story that followed, a story in which triumph and vulnerability coexist, where architectural ambition reveals both the brilliance and the limits of those who dared to dream on such an extravagant scale. The idea of building palaces that could stand not merely for generations, but for entire ages emerged at a moment when the Rothschilds had reached a level of influence that even crowned families regarded with a mixture of admiration and caution. They no longer needed homes in the traditional sense. What they required were statements, structures capable of translating financial dominance into something visible, tangible, irrefutable. Where monarchs leaned on lineage, the Rothschilds leaned on creation. Their estates would not inherit prestige, they would manufacture it. In the middle of the 19th century, James Meyer de Rothschild, already recognized as one of the most powerful financiers in Europe, began imagining a residence that would not simply host gatherings, but would crystallize his entire legacy in stone. Château Rothschild was conceived as a declaration, not a shelter. A modern Versailles commissioned by a man who understood that power must be seen to be fully acknowledged. Plans evolved not around comfort, but around symbolism. Facades stretching with disciplined symmetry, rare stones sourced from regions whose names alone sounded expensive, and interiors intended to overwhelm guests before they could remove their gloves. The estate would rise like a coronation crown along the edge of Boulogne-Billancourt, each architectural detail reinforcing one message: the new aristocracy had arrived. At the same time, across the channel, another branch of the family prepared a parallel monument to ambition. Baron Mayer de Rothschild envisioned Mentmore Towers as a masterpiece capable of standing shoulder to shoulder with England's grandest historic homes, even though it belonged to a dynasty barely a century removed from a Frankfurt courtyard. Mentmore was not meant to imitate tradition. It was meant to update it, blending Jacobean revival elegance with Victorian engineering breakthroughs that promised both spectacle and durability. The estate was to be not only vast but meticulously orchestrated, a home scaled to the expectations of visitors who had likely already seen the wonders of Europe. Both estates emerged from a shared philosophy. That architecture could stabilize reputation in a world where fortunes moved quickly, and public opinion even quicker. A palace could endure shifting markets, shifting politics, shifting alliances. It could outlast newspapers and scandals and financial storms. A palace, if magnificent enough, could become a kind of anchor, holding a family in place no matter what the century attempted to change. And so, the Rothschilds did not merely commission homes. They initiated a dynasty of buildings, structures intended to function as the physical embodiment of a family's ascent from obscurity into a role once reserved for monarchs. Their vision fed on scale. A grand staircase could not simply be elegant, it needed to dominate the entrance hall. A garden could not simply be pretty. It needed to stretch far enough that a guest could wander for hours and still feel they had not reached the edge. Libraries would be designed in anticipation of collections that had not yet been purchased, and banquet halls would be constructed large enough to host gatherings that had not yet been planned. These houses were temples to possibility, infrastructure designed for dreams as much as for actual living. Yet this confidence relied on one crucial ingredient: someone capable of turning extravagant ideas into functional reality. The family held the vision, but the work required an individual who could translate ambition into blueprints, materials, and mathematical precision, someone whose skill matched their appetite for grandeur. And so, as the foundations were cleared and the surrounding landscapes reshaped to match their monumental plans, a new figure stepped into the story. But greatness always begins with an architect. When James Mayer de Rothschild entrusted his vision to architect Joseph Armand Berthelin, he was not merely hiring a professional, he was selecting a collaborator capable of transforming the family's financial aura into a physical realm of power. Berthelin understood immediately that this commission did not ask for beauty alone. It demanded scale, symmetry, and an architectural presence so commanding that even seasoned aristocrats would feel dwarfed upon arrival. With that mandate, Château Rothschild took shape as a deliberate challenge to the great palaces of Europe. Versailles was not a reference, it was a rival. The design pushed beyond accepted standards of luxury. Berthelin chose a pale limestone whose smooth surface and subtle luminosity could shift from gold to marble white, depending on the angle of the sun. Entire quarries were dedicated solely to this project, guaranteeing that every facade block matched perfectly, as if the building had grown organically from a single piece of stone. Columns of deep red marble were imported from distant regions at extraordinary cost, not for structural necessity, but for dramatic effect. In the grand salons, visitors would be surrounded by elaborate frescoes, executed by accomplished artists who painted directly onto wet plaster to ensure colors bonded permanently with the walls. These vibrant surfaces were conceived as living murals, immune to fading and meant to outlast generations. The gardens posed an equally formidable undertaking. Rather than choosing one style, Berthelin merged two worlds: the disciplined geometry of French landscape design and the softer, more fluid contours associated with English-style gardens. The result was a hybrid landscape that demanded enormous upkeep, streams engineered to flow at controlled rates, waterfalls fed by hidden channels, and terraces constructed with such precision that even a single frost could threaten their symmetry. Yet, in their prime, these grounds created the illusion of endless orchestration, nature performing under the guidance of invisible hands. Across the Channel, Sir Joseph Paxton approached Mentmore Towers with a different mindset, though no less ambitious. Fresh from his triumph designing the Crystal Palace, Paxton carried the confidence of a man who had seen glass and iron rewrite architectural possibility. For Mentmore, he fused the ornamental gravitas of Jacobean revival with technological advancements of the industrial age. His crowning feature, a central hall rising nearly 100 feet high, covered by an enormous glazed roof, was nothing short of revolutionary. It allowed natural light to flood the interior from every angle, turning the space into a luminous court reminiscent of Renaissance palazzos, but achieved through Victorian engineering genius. Paxton's precision extended into the hidden world beneath the floors and behind the walls. Heating systems were routed through networks of ducts designed to distribute warmth evenly across immense rooms. Structural supports were reinforced with iron to avoid the sagging common in older mansions. Even the servant corridors followed ergonomic logic, minimizing the distances between kitchens, pantries, and dining halls so that meals could be delivered at exact temperatures and schedules. What the visitors saw was opulence. What the servants navigated was an early form of logistical choreography. Yet both architects, in their mastery, created palaces that demanded constant attention. A roof stretching over halls of such vast width required frequent reinforcement. Marble and limestone needed teams of specialists to polish, repair, and protect their surfaces from the slightest weather impact. Ornamental plasterwork had to be inspected regularly for cracks. Water features demanded continuous monitoring, or else their delicately engineered flows would stagnate or overflow. Even the elaborate glasswork in Mentmore's central hall required professionals capable of sealing humidity leaks and replacing panes without disturbing the framework. No one questioned these requirements during construction because the Rothschilds seemed inexhaustible in means and ambition. These homes were designed to impress in the moment, not to anticipate a world where labor forces shrank, taxes ballooned, and aristocratic lifestyles lost their political relevance. Their creators understood magnificence. They could not foresee the century that would later struggle to sustain it. For all their architectural brilliance, these residences remained silent shells, spectacular, intricate, and waiting. They possessed everything except the one element that would make them whole, because no matter how perfect the geometry, how rare the marble, or how groundbreaking the engineering, a house is only a monument until life steps inside. When the doors of the newly completed palaces finally opened, the architecture that had once seemed frozen in ceremonial stillness began to pulse with movement. Staff hurried along polished corridors, their footsteps softened by carpets imported from the finest workshops. Light flickered across marble columns as servants drew back heavy drapery to welcome the day. The houses, which had stood like dormant titans through years of construction, began to breathe in rhythm with the lives of the people who now filled them. Château Rothschild and Mentmore Towers were no longer static achievements. They had become organisms, alive with ritual, sound, and purpose. At Château Rothschild, mornings often began with the gentle echo of music drifting from the grand salons. It wasn't unusual for distinguished guests to wake to the notes of instruments being tuned for evening performances. Among the visitors who shaped the home's identity most profoundly was Frédéric Chopin, whose presence elevated the estate from a symbol of wealth to a sanctuary of culture. His compositions filled the music room with a softness that contrasted the palace's monumental scale, granting intimate warmth to spaces designed for spectacle. The Vals Opera 64, dedicated within these walls to Charlotte de Rothschild, became an enduring testament to the house's place in artistic history. Beyond the salons, the gardens provided an entirely different symphony, one orchestrated not by musicians, but by nature disciplined into art. 50, sometimes 60 gardeners tended the grounds daily, pruning, shaping, sweeping, watering, and adjusting the carefully balanced flow of water that animated the artificial streams. Pathways unfurled through groves where exotic birds moved freely, and ornamental bridges arched over ponds designed to mirror the changing sky. The gardens did not simply decorate the estate, They staged the backdrop for diplomatic discussions, intimate walks, and celebrations that often lasted until dawn. Conversations that influenced European politics unfolded in these outdoor rooms as seamlessly as they did inside the gilded halls. Inside, however, was where the choreography of grandeur reached its peak. A household of nearly 100 staff members worked in coordinated silence, each person trained to contribute to the illusion that everything happened effortlessly. Meals appeared precisely on schedule, delivered from kitchens located far from the dining rooms to avoid noise or smoke. Footmen glided between tables without crossing paths, their movements refined through hours of practice. Butlers memorized the preferences of every guest so precisely that even the placement of a chair or selection of wine felt preordained. The estate's internal systems, concealed corridors, discreet service entrances, carefully planned acoustics, allowed life to unfold with an elegance that seemed almost supernatural. Mentmore Towers brought a slightly different energy, one shaped by English tradition and the ambitions of Baron Meyer de Rothschild and his daughter Hannah. Visitors often described entering the Great Hall as stepping into a world that seemed suspended between reality and imagination. Sunlight streamed through the towering glazed roof, illuminating tapestries, carved staircases, and objects arranged with meticulous care. Every wing of the house presented a different universe, galleries dedicated to enamels, rooms curated around amber treasures, libraries whose walls formed an uninterrupted horizon of books. Guests, from political leaders to literary figures, found themselves drawn not only to the opulence but to the intellectual vibrancy cultivated there. Life within these walls followed a rhythm that shaped the days with almost ceremonial precision. Breakfast created a gentle beginning. Lunch signaled the transition into social or political engagement. Tea brought conversation into focus. Dinner elevated the entire day into a formal performance, each course revealing another layer of craftsmanship and hospitality. The houses were vast, but nothing inside them felt accidental. Every hour had its purpose, every event its choreography. Children grew up wandering through rooms where history whispered from every surface. Tutors guided them through languages, literature, and culture in rooms decorated with masterpieces that other families would only encounter in museums. The estates shaped their worldview, offering a sense of protected abundance that few other environments could replicate. To them, the houses were not extraordinary. They were simply home, albeit a home built on a scale that required an entire community to sustain it. With every season, every celebration, and every gathering of influential minds, these palaces strengthened their identity. They had achieved what their architects had envisioned. They were alive, dynamic, constantly evolving. And yet, within this vibrant world, a quiet shift was beginning. Subtle at first, almost imperceptible. Forces beyond the gardens, beyond the music, beyond the walls themselves were gathering strength, preparing to challenge the very foundations upon which this magnificence rested. The walls were alive, but the world outside them was changing. Behind the brilliance of these palaces lay a hidden universe, an intricate network of corridors, systems, and human labor that allowed daily life to unfold with almost ceremonial precision. To the guests who crossed polished marble floors or wandered through vast galleries, the estates appeared effortless, as if beauty and order simply materialized by magic. Yet just out of view existed a machinery so elaborate that the houses functioned more like miniature cities than private residences, with every wing, staircase, and underground passage performing a deliberate role in sustaining the illusion of seamless grandeur. Beneath Château Rothschild stretched a network of service tunnels designed to keep the movement of staff invisible. These corridors connected distant kitchens to the formal dining rooms, allowing dishes to travel quickly without disturbing the atmosphere above. The tunnels were wide enough for carts transporting hot food under insulated covers, ensuring that each course arrived at the exact temperature intended by the chef. Lantern brackets lined the walls to maintain consistent lighting, and the floors were reinforced to handle constant movement. Above ground, guests would never have suspected that dozens of people were working in synchronized precision just below their feet. The kitchens themselves operated like well-orchestrated workshops. Multiple rooms served different culinary purposes, one dedicated to pastries, another for butchery, a third for sauces, and a fourth for preparation of the elaborate desserts that had become a hallmark of Rothschild entertaining. Copper pots and pans hung in rows along the walls, polished to a gleam that reflected firelight from the great stoves. The constant heat required ventilation channels built into the walls, which drew air upward and out through concealed openings in the rooftops. Every architectural detail served both beauty and function. Even the location of the chimneys was chosen, so as not to disrupt the palace's symmetrical exterior. Inside Mentmore Towers, the hidden machinery was just as elaborate. Paxton's engineers built service stairs, completely separate from the grand ones, spiraling through the interior like a nervous system, allowing staff to reach any room without crossing the line of sight of visitors. These stairs linked to narrow hallways behind the paneling, where footmen could wait in silence for the exact moment they were needed. Storage rooms stretched across entire wings, filled with seasonal decorations, priceless china, trunks of formal attire, and supplies measured not in boxes but in tall stacks reaching toward ceilings, reinforced for heavy loads. The libraries formed another layer of the estate's internal structure, designed not simply for display, but for intellectual purpose. Walls of books created insulated chambers where scholars, tutors, and family members could retreat into focused study. Specialized cabinets protected maps, letters, and rare volumes from humidity through ventilation built into the shelving itself. The rooms often connected to private studies via small concealed doors that allowed family members to move between spaces discreetly, an escape route from conversations, obligations, or the constant presence of guests. Schoolrooms added a different dynamic, revealing how the estates functioned not only as residences, but as environments for shaping the next generation. These spaces were crafted with warm wood, large windows, and acoustics that softened sound, allowing tutors to teach languages, literature, arithmetic, and music in comfort. Children navigated between these rooms and the gardens, learning in a world where education and architecture intertwined, where even informal lessons occurred, surrounded by sculptures, paintings, and decorative arts that served as part of their curriculum. Then there were the secret rooms, small, often windowless spaces tucked behind bookcases or hidden within walls thicker than they appeared from the outside. Some stored valuable objects, others provided secure retreat for moments requiring privacy. A few contained old safes built directly into the stone, their heavy doors concealed by carved wooden panels. These rooms echoed earlier eras of European history, when families of status required discreet places to hold sensitive documents or to protect collections that might attract unwanted attention. Keeping such immense estates functional required constant vigilance. Water systems feeding fountains and cascades needed checks every morning, with gardeners inspecting each pump and channel to ensure proper flow. Lighting, whether candle-based or later converted to more modern forms, required continuous monitoring. Furnaces, pipes, and ventilation shafts needed cleaning and adjustments. Even sound management was part of the operation. Carpets and curtains had to be positioned precisely to prevent echoes in the halls from overwhelming conversation. Every day resembled a grand performance, and the hidden infrastructure served as the backstage. Staff rose before dawn to begin preparations that would remain invisible, and they worked long after guests retired for the night to restore balance for the next day's events. The walls absorbed the rhythm of this labor, learning the patterns of footsteps in the lower halls and the ebb and flow of voices above. From the outside, the estates seemed to glide through time with elegant composure, but beneath their surfaces operated a world of effort, engineering, and unbroken routine. A world essential to sustaining the illusion of effortless magnificence. And while the houses thrived in this orchestrated harmony, life within them was about to encounter forces far greater than their hidden machinery could resist. Because even the most perfect mechanism begins to falter when the world outside starts to shift. The harmony that had once defined life inside the Rothschild palaces began to falter long before a single stone crumbled or a single roofline sagged. The change arrived quietly, disguised as new laws, shifting political sentiments, and emerging economic realities that seemed at first to have little to do with the elegant rooms where statesmen gathered and orchestras performed. Yet each development, subtle on its own, began carving fissures into the foundation of a lifestyle built on constancy. Europe was entering a new era, and the grand estates, rooted in a world that depended on vast domestic staff, low taxation, and social systems built around hierarchy, found themselves increasingly out of step with the forces reshaping the continent. One of the earliest signs of strain emerged through the steady rise of property taxes across Europe. Nations recovering from political upheaval, balancing new social programs, or seeking revenue in turbulent times, turned to wealth anchored in land as a dependable source of income. For families like the Rothschilds, who owned estates with hundreds of acres, ornamental gardens, stables, lakes, and intricate waterworks, taxes alone grew into figures that would have once been unimaginable. What had been manageable under 19th century systems suddenly demanded financial output on a scale that rivaled the cost of building the homes in the first place. The palaces had been designed to impress royalty, not tax collectors. Simultaneously, political shifts began altering the fabric of European aristocratic culture. The public grew increasingly skeptical of enormous private estates that required armies of servants to maintain, especially as new ideologies promoting equality and modernization gained momentum. Grand houses that had once symbolized achievement and sophistication now appeared to some as relics of an outdated system. Their upkeep required not only financial resources, but a social climate that tolerated, even celebrated, extravagant domestic arrangements. That climate was evaporating. The staff these estates depended upon, once abundant, became harder to find as new forms of employment emerged, and younger generations sought opportunities beyond service roles. Without the human infrastructure, even the best-designed houses began to strain under their own weight. The economic environment was shifting as well. Industrialization had altered how wealth moved through society, and the Rothschilds, masters of finance, adapted brilliantly in their business ventures. Yet even they faced a new challenge: immovable assets. Factories, railways, and financial institutions could evolve. Stone could not. Maintaining colossal buildings that demanded constant restoration, specialized craftsmanship, and uninterrupted attention became a financial commitment disconnected from the efficiency-focused strategies guiding the modernizing world. A palace designed for the tempo of the 19th century struggled to survive in an age driven by accelerating change. As Europe approached the 20th century, fluctuations in global markets and periods of recession amplified these pressures. Even wealthy families began reassessing long-term obligations that no longer aligned with contemporary economic structures. A residence requiring 60 gardeners and 100 staff members, once an expression of triumph, now resembled a financial sinkhole. The Rothschilds never lacked resources, but they understood, earlier than most, that the model sustaining these estates was beginning to collapse. The houses were consuming vast sums in silence, demanding more care each year, while offering less relevance to the world outside their gates. And then came the instability that spread across the continent. Social reforms, political movements, and shifts in public opinion that further eroded the foundation supporting aristocratic living. The estates, which once projected confidence and permanence, began to embody vulnerability instead. Their immense size transformed from an asset into a liability, their architectural uniqueness into a magnet for scrutiny, their gardens into expanses that seemed impossible to defend against the changing winds of history. Just as their architects had engineered every beam and fresco to endure centuries, the world itself had begun engineering circumstances that threatened those very creations. The palaces had been built to dominate their surroundings, to rise above the world's uncertainties. But now, the uncertainties were rising faster than the estates could adapt. And it was only the beginning, for beyond these first cracks loomed far greater forces, events that would sweep across borders, displace nations, and challenge the very idea that any house, no matter how magnificent, could stand untouched by the storms of history. The first tremors of conflict reached the great estates as distant rumblings, unsettling, but still far from the manicured lawns and gilded salons that had known only order. Yet, as Europe accelerated toward war, the illusion of distance dissolved. Borders blurred, governments fell, and suddenly even the most fortified symbols of privilege found themselves exposed to forces no architecture could repel. The palaces that once hosted prime ministers and composers now faced an entirely different kind of visitor, one that did not arrive to admire their beauty, but to claim and dismantle it. Château Rothschild was among the first to feel the full weight of this transformation. When the German occupation advanced into France, the estate's gates, once opened only for dignitaries, were forced aside by military convoys. The house that had been created to represent triumph and stability became a strategic headquarters, its halls filled not with conversation, but with uniforms, equipment, and the stark efficiency of an occupying force. Within days, the palace's identity had been overtaken. Within weeks, the systematic extraction of its cultural treasures had begun. The plunder unfolded with chilling organization. Catalogs were created to document every porcelain piece, every canvas, every sculpture, every item of furniture that generations of Rothschilds had collected with careful intention. Crates were assigned codes, marked and prepared for shipment to high-ranking officials. Artworks that had once been admired for their craftsmanship were now reduced to inventory, a set of objects to be redistributed according to political favor. Fragile Japanese porcelain disappeared into wooden boxes. Tapestries were rolled tightly and sealed. Decorative items were wrapped without regard for the emotional imprint they carried. The palace became a warehouse of losses. Outside, the gardens, meticulously shaped over decades by dozens of professionals, faced their own devastation. Military trucks, too heavy for the delicate terrain, crushed pathways that had been engineered to control water flow and preserve the shape of the landscape. Ornamental bridges, never designed for rough handling, splintered under the weight of passing vehicles. Pagodas, once cherished for their elegance and cultural symbolism, were dismantled and thrown into fires to provide warmth for soldiers unaccustomed to the damp chill of the region. The garden, which had survived storms, droughts, and changing fashion, could not withstand this new form of occupation. Inside, the damage was no less profound. Furniture was pushed aside to make space for communications equipment. Walls were drilled to support cables. Carpets that had once cushioned the steps of celebrated guests were worn down by boots that cared nothing for their history. The palace's internal rhythm, the pulse that had animated it during years of celebrations and political gatherings, fell silent. In its place emerged the mechanical repetition of a military installation. Commands, footsteps, and the utilitarian movement of strangers through rooms that no longer resembled themselves. When the conflict reached its turning point and liberation forces swept through the region, the estate did not receive the gentle recovery it needed. Instead, exhausted troops established temporary camps on the grounds. Seeking warmth after long nights outdoors, they burned whatever wood they could find, unaware of the cultural importance of the structures they dismantled. Trucks continued to erode the gardens. The house, already wounded, absorbed further damage. Careless, unintentional, but devastating all the same. By the time peace finally returned, Château Rothschild no longer resembled the architectural crown it had once been. The plundered rooms echoed with emptiness. The frescoes that had survived were coated with soot. The floors bore scars from equipment and makeshift repairs. The gardens, once the pride of the estate, appeared unrecognizable, overtaken by debris and stripped of their most delicate features. It was as though the palace had aged a century in the span of a few years, its identity rewritten by forces it could neither anticipate nor defend against. The war had not merely occupied the house, it had entered it, reshaped it, and left it suspended between life and ruin. And for the families connected to these estates, returning to such transformed spaces brought an entirely different kind of loss, one that extended beyond architecture into memory itself. Yet even as physical wounds slowly healed, a new struggle emerged, one driven not by armies, but by the advancing pressures of a rapidly changing world. The conflict had passed, but its shadow would linger in ways that threatened to erase what generations had built. When the war finally loosened its grip and the last military vehicles rolled away, the palaces stood waiting, not proudly, not defiantly, but with a wounded stillness that revealed just how deeply they had been altered. For years, these estates had embodied triumph and continuity. Now they seemed to carry a presence that was heavier, quieter, and profoundly changed. The stone walls remained, the familiar silhouette still rising against the sky, yet the essence of the homes had shifted so dramatically that returning heirs found themselves confronting not the comfort of memory, but the shock of displacement within their own heritage. For many descendants, the journey back to the family estates was far more difficult than any physical distance implied. They approached through overgrown grounds where paths once tended by dozens of gardeners had dissolved into wild vegetation, as if nature itself had attempted to cover the scars left by occupation. Even from outside, the houses appeared hollowed, windows darkened, shutters misaligned, roofs incomplete. What had once greeted them with light and hospitality now seemed to watch silently, offering no warmth, only the stark reminder of what had been taken. Crossing the threshold was, for some, impossible. The rooms where ancestors had celebrated births, marriages, partnerships, musical evenings, and political triumphs now bore marks of intrusion and disregard. Walls were weathered beyond recognition, doors hung crooked, and the familiar scent of polished wood and beeswax had been replaced by the cold, dusty air of abandonment. The emptiness intensified the sense of rupture. Objects that had defined these spaces, porcelain sets, paintings, furniture passed down for generations, were gone, leaving outlines on walls and lighter patches on floors where sunlight had once been shielded by ornate rugs. For heirs who had grown up surrounded by ritual and continuity, the change was not merely material. These houses had been repositories of identity, repositories that held childhood stories, family history, and a sense of belonging that transcended individual years. To discover them transformed into hollow shells felt like losing a part of themselves, something woven into memory so deeply that no restoration could fully mend the break. Some stood inside their old rooms for only a moment before retreating, overwhelmed not by what they saw, but by what they could no longer feel. In certain estates, the damage reached deeper layers of meaning. The war had not only taken objects, it had altered the emotional architecture of the homes. The knowledge of who had occupied these spaces and how they had been used carried its own weight. Rooms that had once hosted conversations among statesmen now held echoes of commands issued by foreign officers. Gardens that had sheltered confidences and celebrations had been scarred by heavy machinery and stripped for firewood. This awareness lingered heavily, turning the estates into unfamiliar landscapes where the past and present no longer aligned. As years passed, the emotional distance deepened. Some members of the family chose not to return at all, preferring to hold on to memories rather than confront the reality that time and conflict had reshaped. Others tried to visit, only to realize that stepping inside felt like reopening a wound that had never properly healed. Each broken fresco, each collapsed ceiling, each damaged railing seemed to bear witness to the fact that this world, once so carefully maintained, could not be restored to what it had been. Practical considerations eventually reinforced these emotional barriers. The cost of repairing even a single wing, the challenge of restoring intricate craftsmanship, and the sheer volume of work required to reverse years of neglect made revival feel increasingly unattainable. The estates had entered a new phase of existence, too damaged to inhabit, too costly to revive, and too significant to simply dispose of. As a result, many remained suspended in a kind of architectural limbo, too meaningful to erase, too painful to approach. In this way, the palaces evolved into monuments of absence. They stood not only as reminders of a vanished era of aristocratic life, but also as symbols of the psychological rupture left in the wake of conflict. Their grandeur had been stripped away, yet traces of former brilliance remained like faint constellations on a fading night sky. The families who once animated these spaces now found themselves drifting away, leaving the houses to settle into their new identities as abandoned guardians of memories too heavy to reclaim. And as these vast structures slowly succumbed to time and weather, absorbing the silence that had taken root inside them, the burden they placed on their owners grew even greater. The palaces no longer demanded staff and celebrations. They demanded decisions. And the world was shifting in ways that made those decisions more urgent with each passing year. Left untended, the great estate slipped into a phase of decline that felt eerily gentle at first, quiet, almost dignified, as though the houses were trying to preserve the last fragments of their former selves. But slow deterioration is often the most merciless kind. What begins as a loose shutter or a cracked window frame soon becomes an unraveling that no single intervention can reverse. And as the years advanced, the palaces that had once embodied mastery and precision began yielding to forces far older and more patient than any dynasty. Weather, gravity, and time. The roofs were the first to signal the shift. Slate tiles, once carefully aligned in mathematical harmony, began to loosen as storms swept across the region. A few missing tiles allowed water to slip through, dampening beams that had survived entire generations without complaint. Moisture crept steadily downward, softening wood, eroding plaster, and seeping into the elaborate decorative finishes designed to last centuries. As these beams weakened, the structure they supported began to sag. Eventually, entire sections of roofing collapsed inward with a sound that echoed through halls now devoid of music and conversation. The gaps opened the house to the sky, and every rainfall, once controlled and celebrated in ornamental fountains, became a destructive force. With nature reclaiming entry, the gardens that had once been shaped through strict geometry expanded without restraint. Trees grew sideways into broken balconies. Weeds overtook pathways where aristocrats once strolled in tailored attire. Roots pushed against stone foundations, widening cracks and loosening blocks that had once fit seamlessly into place. Moss spread across walls, softening sharp edges until the building appeared to blur into its surroundings. What was once carefully curated artistry devolved into an engulfing wilderness that seemed determined to erase the memory of the estate's manicured origins. Inevitably, the absence of caretakers invited another presence, that of explorers, thrill-seekers, and vandals drawn to the mystery of abandoned grandeur. They slipped through broken gates and climbed through shattered windows, navigating rooms illuminated only by beams of daylight, filtering through ruined ceilings. At first, they entered with curiosity, marveling at the remnants of frescoes, marble staircases, and fragments of gilded molding still clinging to the walls. But over time, fascination gave way to intrusion. Graffiti began to appear, first small, then sprawling, made with bright paint that clashed violently against the fading elegance of the interiors. Chairs were broken, mirrors shattered, and remnants of the once perfect decor scattered across dusty floors. The palaces, designed to feel limitless in space, now felt cavernous and exposed. Drafts whispered through gaps in the stone. Birds nested in upper chambers, leaves collected in corners where footmen once polished floors into mirrors. Each hallway carried its own signature of decay. Some bore the scent of damp wood, others the metallic smell of rusting fixtures. The once dazzling chandeliers, stripped long ago of their crystals, hung like skeletal reminders of a brilliance that no longer had the strength to shine. As more ceilings collapsed, floors buckled beneath the weight of debris. The houses became hazardous labyrinths, where every step required caution, staircases warped under years of moisture and neglect, and balustrades that once guided elegantly dressed visitors grew brittle enough to crumble under a single touch. What had been built to celebrate precision and craftsmanship now existed in a state of fragile imbalance, alive only in the sense that they continued to react to the elements, slowly losing the form they had held for generations. Yet, the ruins retained a haunting beauty. Sunlight streaming through the broken roof illuminated particles of dust that drifted like fading memories. Rooms once used for lavish receptions now echoed with the soft sounds of wind pushing through fractured frames. Each ruined corner suggested a story of a celebration, a gathering, a quiet moment, now buried beneath layers of weathered debris. Even in decay, the houses possessed a presence that demanded attention, as if insisting that their decline was not a disappearance but a transformation. Still, no amount of melancholy admiration could conceal reality. The palaces were dying, not in a dramatic collapse, but in a prolonged, indifferent surrender. Every winter brought new damage, every rainstorm weakened another beam, every intruder left another mark. The architecture that once seemed eternal was now learning the language of impermanence, and as the ruins deepened, the burden they placed on their owners grew more pronounced. The palaces had become reminders not only of past magnificence, but of the overwhelming challenge of deciding their future, whether to save them, surrender them, or allow time to finish what history had begun. The decline of the great Rothschild estates did not end with war or abandonment. A quieter, more bureaucratic force rose in the decades that followed, one without armies, without noise, yet capable of inflicting irreversible damage. It came in the form of taxation, a mechanism designed to modernize national economies, but one that proved devastating to houses built for an age when fortunes were measured not by liquidity, but by land, heritage, and collections too valuable to ever sell. For Mentmore Towers, one of the most radiant jewels in the family's English crown, this shift marked the beginning of a battle it could not win. Mentmore had survived political change, survived shifts in fashion, survived the natural erosion of time, but it could not survive a tax policy created for a world that no longer sympathized with the existence of palatial homes, requiring dozens of staff members and vast grounds to function. When the 6th Earl of Rosebery passed away, his heirs faced death duties so immense that even the Rothschild lineage, which had famously mastered the financial systems of Europe, was forced into an impossible calculation. To keep the house, they needed funds that could only be raised by selling a large portion of the estate's assets. To preserve the collection that defined Mentmore's identity, they needed the house to remain intact. Both choices canceled each other out. What followed was an attempt at compromise that could have altered the fate of the estate entirely. The family offered Mentmore Towers to the nation in exchange for a fraction of its value in tax relief, a gesture that would have transformed the property into one of the most important public museums of decorative arts anywhere in the world. The collection inside was unparalleled: tapestries, porcelain, old masters, rare furniture, and one-of-a-kind objects gathered over more than a century of meticulous collecting. It was, in the deepest sense, a cultural treasure trove. Preserving it would have secured not only the estate, but a chapter of European heritage. Yet the proposal arrived at a moment when political optics mattered more than preservation. The government, facing an approaching election and wary of appearing sympathetic to aristocratic privilege, refused the offer. The concern was not the estate's value, but the public messaging. Supporting the rescue of a nobleman's home could be interpreted as a gesture toward an outdated social order. So, the state stepped back, even though the cost of saving Mentmore was far less than what the collection was worth, and infinitely less than what the nation would lose by allowing it to disappear. With no alternative, the family turned to the only remaining option: auction. What unfolded in 1977 became known as the Sale of the Century, a 10-day dismantling of a world that had taken generations to build. Like pages torn from a book rather than turned gently, the contents of Mentmore were separated, cataloged, and displayed to buyers from across the globe. Each room was stripped piece by piece, its identity dissolving as cabinets were emptied, tapestries removed from walls, and artifacts that had never been intended for the marketplace placed behind glass for inspection. There was no preservationist triumph, no last-minute rescue. The hall where sunlight once illuminated tapestries faded by time, now echoed with the hum of bidders murmuring over starting prices. The library, once a sanctuary of scholarship, became an inventory list. Even the most personal items, objects chosen by Hannah de Rothschild and her father with meticulous intention, were reduced to lot numbers. Objects that had been part of a cohesive aesthetic vision were scattered to private collections, museums, and unknown destinations. It wasn't just a house that disappeared. It was an entire cultural ecosystem. By the end of the 10th day, Mentmore had been hollowed with a finality no bomb or natural disaster could have matched. The house remained standing, but its purpose had vanished. Without the collection that animated it, the building became a shell, grand, architectural, imposing, yet fundamentally empty. The sale did not simply raise funds, it closed a chapter of history. A civilization rooted in artistic patronage, ritualized hospitality, intellectual gatherings, and architectural pageantry dissolved under the pressure of modern economic reform. What made Mentmore's story so striking was not the scale of the loss, but the quietness with which it happened. No alarms sounded, no headlines declared a cultural emergency. In 10 days, a world that had shaped politics, art, and society across continents disappeared not with conflict, but with signatures and gavels. And once dispersed, the pieces could never be assembled again. The auction marked a point of no return, not only for Mentmore, but for the idea that such estates could ever again exist as they once did. And as other Rothschild properties faced similar pressures, a pattern emerged. The world that had given rise to these palaces was fading, and the structures now stood at the intersection of history and an uncertain future. Yet, even stripped of their treasures, the houses held another destiny, one that would depend not on governments or heirs, but on the unpredictable, often indifferent hands of time. In the decades that followed the collapse of their original purpose, the abandoned Rothschild estates entered a new and uncertain phase, one shaped not by aristocrats or financiers, but by institutions, developers, educators, and cultural advocates who looked at these immense, damaged structures and saw either possibility or burden. What emerged was a patchwork of reinvention, a series of experiments revealing just how difficult it was to adapt palaces built for a vanished world to the practical needs of a modern society. Some transformations breathed life into the buildings once more. Others merely prolonged their decline under a new name. The earliest efforts focused on necessity rather than grandeur. Institutions seeking space, schools, training centers, conservatories, found opportunity in these oversized relics. Their logic was straightforward. A palace with dozens of rooms offered ample educational facilities, and the grandeur, even in decay, provided an inspiring environment for students unaccustomed to such surroundings. In a few cases, these repurposings succeeded beyond expectations. Large halls became assembly spaces, music rooms made ideal performance venues, and former servant quarters adapted well for administrative offices. The presence of young people introduced a liveliness that the estates had not known since their golden years, transforming quiet ruins into bustling learning environments filled with movement and conversation. But not every adaptation aligned harmoniously with the architecture. Some estates, too ornate or too structurally fragile, resisted conversion. The very features that made them magnificent, ornamental ceilings, curved staircases, rare woodwork, delicate plaster, proved difficult to maintain under the constant activity of a public institution. Maintenance budgets fell short of what the buildings required, and even well-meaning caretakers found themselves overwhelmed. With each passing season, rooms closed due to disrepair, wings were sealed off, and the scope of restoration shrank. What was once imagined as a rebirth drifted instead toward a controlled decline, slowed but not reversed. Elsewhere, more ambitious plans took shape. Developers and cultural organizations proposed turning certain estates into museums that could preserve their historical narratives while generating visitor revenue. When executed well, this approach revitalized the homes with purpose, restoring their interiors and reintroducing the public to a level of craftsmanship rarely found in contemporary architecture. Rooms once reserved for aristocrats became open to anyone who wished to walk through their past. Exhibits recreated the original aesthetic with meticulous accuracy, while modern infrastructure, climate control, lighting, reinforced supports quietly stabilized the structures for long-term survival. In these cases, the palaces regained some measure of their former glory, not through exclusive gatherings, but through the shared curiosity of visitors seeking to understand a world long gone. Yet, for every estate that found a stable future, others faced far more complicated outcomes. Some fell into the hands of buyers with intentions larger than resources, entrepreneurs or investors dazzled by the potential but unaware of the immense responsibilities such buildings demanded. Restoration promises often collapsed under financial strain, leaving partially renovated rooms adjacent to deteriorating ones, a patchwork of progress and regression. Legal disputes emerged over land use, construction permits, and preservation rights, turning the homes into battlegrounds not of war but of paperwork and stalled plans. In these cases, time continued its steady intrusion while human aspirations faltered. The contrast became stark. Certain estates flourished as cultural landmarks, maintained with pride and supported by public engagement. Others lingered in transitional states, neither restored nor abandoned, suspended in uncertainty. The latter group often bore the heaviest sense of melancholy. Scaffolding clung to their facades for years, weathered and rusted. Windows remained boarded, halls stood empty, and the hopes that once surrounded their transformation dissolved into quiet resignation. These houses, despite new ownership, drifted ever closer to the atmosphere of their earlier abandonment, a reminder that not every legacy can be saved by intention alone. Still, each attempt, successful or not, demonstrated something essential. The palaces were no longer merely historic monuments. They had become testing grounds for the modern world's relationship to its own heritage. Whether repurposed into schools full of lively voices, museums guiding visitors through history, or projects stalled between ambition and feasibility, the estates reflected the struggle to reconcile past grandeur with present-day realities. And while some houses found renewed relevance, others slipped deeper into neglect, setting the stage for the next chapter, in which new owners and new visions would collide with the relentless challenges of time, economics, and the ever-changing priorities of society. As the 21st century unfolded, the remaining Rothschild palaces entered a new and harsher era, one defined not by war, taxation, or political resentment, but by something far more indifferent: the slow, unstoppable pressure of time itself. The world around these estates modernized at a pace they could never match, and the grand houses that had once dazzled visiting dignitaries now found themselves stranded in landscapes shaped by different priorities. Their vast rooms, intricate facades, and carefully engineered grounds required a level of care that few individuals or institutions were willing or able to provide. And so, even when new owners stepped forward with bold promises, the realities awaiting them proved overwhelming. Nowhere was this more evident than in the fate of Mentmore Towers, a house that had once symbolized the highest achievements of Victorian design. After the sale of the century stripped it of its legendary interior, Mentmore entered the new millennium hollow but still standing, a magnificent structure in search of a purpose. The buyer who eventually acquired it arrived with grand plans for restoration, hoping to turn the estate into a luxury venue capable of hosting events, celebrations, and cultural gatherings. On paper, the venture seemed plausible. In practice, the problems revealed themselves almost immediately. The first challenge was structural. Years of neglect had allowed water to infiltrate the roofline, softening wooden beams and encouraging mold to creep into upper floors. Repairing such damage was not a simple matter of replacing shingles or patching plaster. It required teams of specialists, scaffolding engulfing entire sections of the building, and budgets that expanded with every inspection. Even as initial repairs began, new issues emerged: hidden rot inside the walls, compromised drainage systems, and damage to the foundations caused by decades of uncontrolled vegetation. The house had endured too long without sufficient upkeep, and every attempt to fix one problem revealed several more waiting beneath it. On top of the architectural challenges came legal complications. Disputes arose between the owners, investors, preservation authorities, and local councils, each with different visions for the property's future. Some parties sought to preserve the estate as a heritage landmark. Others wanted commercial development to justify the costs. Still others argued over land rights, environmental impact, and planning permissions. These disagreements slowed progress until restoration efforts stalled entirely. Scaffolding that was meant to be temporary remained in place for years, exposed to rain and wind, rusting in place as a visual metaphor for promises unfulfilled. Meanwhile, the elements continued their quiet assault. Rainwater seeped through openings in the roof, dripping into once grand rooms and pooling on the floors. Plaster softened and fell away in chunks, revealing the skeletal wooden framework beneath. Ceilings sagged under the accumulated weight of moisture. Decorative stonework cracked as frost settled into its seams. Windows, long since boarded, warped in their frames. Animals found their way into the interior, nesting in spaces once lit by chandeliers and warmed by roaring fireplaces. The estate's deterioration accelerated with each passing season. Without consistent maintenance, even recently repaired portions began to falter again, as though the house were reminding its owners that a century of neglect cannot be undone with intermittent effort. Local preservation groups issued repeated warnings that the structure was at risk of irreversible damage, urging immediate action. Yet the legal disputes, financial strains, and logistical challenges created an environment where progress was always just out of reach. Mentmore existed in a twilight state, too important to demolish, too damaged to restore, too costly to ignore, and too complicated to save. What made its decline particularly haunting was the contrast between what it had been and what it had become. Visitors who managed to glimpse the property from a distance saw the grand outline of Paxton's masterpiece still visible against the sky. But up close, the illusion dissolved. Watermarks streaked the stone. Vegetation crept up the walls. Interior photographs taken by those permitted to enter revealed staircases with missing steps, rooms where the ceiling lay collapsed in splinters on the floor, and corridors where the once shining parquet had buckled into uneven ridges. The house no longer appeared abandoned. It seemed exhausted, and Mentmore was not alone. Across Europe, several Rothschild estates that escaped wartime destruction or mid-century auctions faced similar fates in the new century. They belonged to an architectural species struggling to survive in an ecosystem that no longer supported them. Their size was a liability, their maintenance costs insurmountable, and their historical significance insufficient to mobilize the resources required for full restoration. They stood as landmarks in decay, icons of a past era that modern society admired but could not afford to preserve. For these houses, time became the ultimate ruler, steady, impartial, and relentless. Courts could argue, investors could plan, and preservationists could plead, but the rain never stopped falling, the frost never stopped expanding in the cracks, and the roofs never stopped weakening under their own weight. The very walls that had once symbolized permanence now revealed how fragile grandeur could become when its original world disappears. And as these abandoned giants continued to fade, another layer of their story waited beneath the dust. Hidden spaces, forgotten designs, and architectural secrets preserved only because no one had yet destroyed them. As the great Rothschild estates decayed into silence, their fading walls began to reveal something unexpected. A second life hidden beneath the visible architecture, a network of forgotten rooms and secret spaces that had survived long after the grand salons collapsed and the gardens overgrew their borders. These concealed chambers, once known only to architects, family members, and trusted staff, became the quiet custodians of stories untouched by war, taxation, or abandonment. And as urban explorers, preservationists, and architectural researchers cautiously entered the ruins in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, they discovered that beneath the dust and decay, the palaces still whispered. Some of the most intriguing discoveries emerged inside Mentmore Towers, where investigators found remnants of private libraries that had been concealed behind full-height bookcases. These hidden rooms were designed for discreet study or confidential discussions, places where sensitive correspondence could be reviewed without interruption. The entrances were ingeniously crafted. A panel disguised as a row of spines would shift inward, revealing a narrow passage leading to a chamber lined with shelves and furnished with a simple writing desk. Even in ruin, these spaces retained an atmosphere of intimacy, as if the world outside their walls had never existed. Dust-covered books lay scattered across the floor, their pages warped but still legible, offering glimpses into the intellectual lives of inhabitants who once used these rooms as sanctuaries from the demands of public life. Château Rothschild offered discoveries of a different scale. Beneath the estate, explorers uncovered an extensive air raid shelter constructed in 1937, an elaborate series of reinforced chambers intended to protect the family's priceless art collection as Europe edged toward conflict. The shelter included multiple interconnected rooms with ventilation shafts, emergency lighting fixtures, and reinforced concrete walls designed to withstand significant impact. Although much of the collection had been removed or seized during the war, the architecture itself remained intact. The chambers bore markings from the past, handwritten labels near storage racks, remnants of protective coverings, and faint outlines on the walls where paintings or crates had once been secured. The space conveyed an eerie sense of urgency frozen in time, a testament to the family's attempt to safeguard beauty in an era hurtling toward destruction. Over time, these subterranean spaces took on unexpected new roles. Urban explorers reported evidence that the air raid shelter later became a venue for clandestine gatherings. Footprints, scattered debris, and remnants of lighting equipment suggested that parties had been held deep within the ruins. Accounts described groups of masked visitors navigating the dark corridors, turning the forgotten bunker into a surreal ballroom where music echoed through chambers once intended for preservation, not revelry. The idea of celebration inside a structure built to protect against catastrophe added a haunting layer to the estate's already complicated identity. Other discoveries revealed practical secrets of past generations: narrow shafts used by servants to move discreetly between floors, storage rooms hidden behind false walls, and passageways connecting distant wings of the estates. These features, once integral to the smooth operation of the palaces, had been forgotten over time, buried beneath renovations and recollections. In some houses, explorers found remnants of coded markings used by staff to coordinate tasks unseen by guests. In others, they uncovered mechanical systems long removed from public memory, pulleys, old communication tubes, and ventilation channels that showcased the ingenuity required to make these enormous residences function seamlessly. Perhaps the most evocative finds were the rooms untouched by vandals or weather. These spaces, sealed for decades, preserved fragments of their original atmosphere. Wallpaper faded but still patterned, fragments of chandeliers resting where they had fallen, and furniture left behind because it was too unwieldy or forgotten to move. In these untouched corners, the estate seemed suspended in a delicate time capsule, allowing visitors to imagine the moment the doors were last closed, the last lamp extinguished, the last footsteps fading into silence. The discoveries underscored a striking truth. Even as the visible parts of the palaces fell into ruin, their hidden interiors survived with surprising resilience. These secret rooms were not designed for grandeur, but for function, privacy, and protection. Their enduring presence offered clues to the daily rhythms, anxieties, and ambitions of the families who once lived there. And as more layers of the estates were uncovered, it became clear that the story of the Rothschild houses extended far beyond what was visible on their facades. Yet the secrets buried within these walls also highlighted a growing urgency. Every winter weakened the structures further. Every storm threatened to collapse another forgotten room. The race to document, preserve, or revive these remnants depended not only on curiosity, but on time, because even the most resilient secrets cannot survive forever in buildings caught between memory and oblivion. And as these hidden chambers came back into view, the treasures once contained within them began to reappear as well. Not in the estates themselves, but scattered across the world in auction catalogs, museums, and private collections, setting the stage for another chapter, defined not by architecture, but by the afterlife of the objects once sheltered inside these magnificent homes. As the physical structures of the Rothschild palaces crumbled, the objects that once animated them, paintings, sculptures, tapestries, porcelains, rare books, exquisite furniture, embarked on lives of their own. No longer part of cohesive interiors, they became commodities, catalogued and photographed under bright auction house lighting. Stripped of the architectural context that had once given them meaning, their journeys across decades revealed both the fragility and the astonishing resilience of cultural heritage. Even as the houses collapsed, their treasures continued to move through the world, gaining value precisely because the environments that once protected them no longer existed. The first great dispersal came during the Mentmore sale, but it was only the beginning. Across the 20th and 21st centuries, Christie's, Sotheby's, and other major auction houses regularly featured items with Rothschild provenance, two words that instantly transformed any object, no matter how modest, into something of heightened desirability. Buyers were captivated not only by craftsmanship, but by the story attached to each piece. A cabinet that once stood in a salon, lit by crystal chandeliers, carried with it the weight of imagined conversations, receptions, and private moments. A porcelain figure that survived the war felt like a relic of endurance. Even the smallest personal accessories, when traced back to the Rothschild estates, were treated as fragments of a lost civilization. Some items experienced a peculiar double life, sold once during mid-century dispersals and then reappearing decades later at exponentially higher valuations. A Roman cameo originally sold by the family in the 19th century resurfaced in a modern Christie's auction, fetching a price far beyond its original worth. Not because the stone had changed, but because its absence from the palaces had turned it into a symbol of everything those estates had once represented. The fewer objects that remained publicly traced back to the Rothschild homes, the more valuable each surviving piece became. The market rewarded scarcity, nostalgia, and the allure of a vanished aristocratic world. Furniture experienced similar migrations. Elaborately carved cabinets, writing desks, and armchairs that once aligned harmoniously within meticulously curated rooms were now dispersed into private collections across continents. Many pieces acquired new identities, some restored and showcased in contemporary interiors, others displayed in museums where their original function was replaced by explanatory plaques. A chair that once welcomed state leaders at Mentmore might now sit behind a velvet barrier in a gallery, admired for its design, but disconnected from its former surroundings. The disconnect added an almost surreal quality to their afterlives, as if the objects themselves had outlived the homes meant to protect them. The most striking irony lay in the escalating value of items precisely because their architectural contexts had been lost. A tapestry that hung for decades in an undisturbed salon was worth one thing. That same tapestry, once saved from a collapsing roof or salvaged from an abandoned gallery, was worth far more. Collectors and institutions recognized that the chance to acquire a Rothschild artifact from a palace no longer standing, or standing only in ruin, was becoming vanishingly rare. The destruction increased desirability. The fading of the estates enhanced the brilliance of the pieces that survived. Auction catalogs began to resemble archaeological records, each lot an artifact from a dispersed world. Descriptions emphasized not only craftsmanship, but the specific rooms where the pieces had once lived, inviting buyers to imagine the glow of candlelight on gilded surfaces, or the sound of footsteps echoing in corridors now lost to time. Provenance became a story in itself, a way of resurrecting spaces that could not be restored. Each sale marked both an end and a continuation, the severing of an object from its original narrative and the creation of a new lineage defined by collectors, curators, and future auctions. Meanwhile, countless objects that never reached the public eye continued their quiet migrations through private hands. Some resurfaced in unexpected places, castles in Austria, villas in Italy, townhouses in New York. Others disappeared entirely, known only through grainy photographs taken decades earlier. Their absence underscored the scale of the dispersal. No one could fully track the diaspora of these treasures, just as no one could reconstruct the full interiors of the houses from which they came. Yet, by the 21st century, a strange equilibrium emerged. The houses themselves were deteriorating faster than ever, but their artifacts were thriving, preserved in climate-controlled environments or cherished in private residences. The palaces had become unstable, but their artistic legacy had never been more secure. The value of each item soared not only because of rarity or beauty, but because each represented a fragment of a world that no longer existed, a world whose architecture had failed, but whose art endured. And as the objects continued their journeys through auctions and collections, the estates that once held them faced choices even more dramatic. Either find a way to rise again through restoration, or remain as haunting monuments to a civilization that could not survive the weight of its own grandeur. As the 21st century advanced, the remaining Rothschild palaces found themselves standing at a crossroads, neither entirely lost to decay nor fully anchored to the future. Their fate depended not on inherited wealth or aristocratic ambition, but on investors, preservationists, architects, and local governments grappling with an uncomfortable truth. The cost of saving these monumental structures often exceeded the cost of building new ones. Yet, despite decades of ruin, the palaces still possessed a gravitational pull strong enough to attract those willing to attempt the impossible. And from this unlikely convergence of longing and practicality emerged a wave of modern restoration projects that promised to rescue the estates, but only through compromises their original creators would never have imagined. The revival of Château Rothschild in Boulogne-Billancourt became emblematic of this new era. Developers proposed an ambitious restoration plan backed by multi-million euro investment, aiming to bring the palace back to the majesty it once embodied. But restoring a structure battered by war, weather, and decades of neglect required not only financial resources, but architectural reinvention. Entire sections needed to be rebuilt, frescoes recreated, foundations reinforced, and landscapes redesigned to fit the constraints of modern environmental standards. To offset the astronomical expense, the developers introduced a controversial solution: constructing modern residential buildings on the historic grounds. For purists, this felt like an intrusion. For planners, it was the only viable path towards saving the estates from irreversible collapse. What emerged was a hybrid vision, part tribute, part survival strategy, reflecting the tension between cultural preservation and economic necessity. Other estates faced equally complex negotiations with the present. Some found new life as museums supported by charitable foundations. Waddesdon Manor, still under Rothschild stewardship, demonstrated how a historic estate could thrive when resources aligned with vision. Through careful restoration, modern climate control, and thoughtful curation, the manor transformed into a cultural landmark visited by hundreds of thousands each year. It stood as proof that a palace could adapt, if it received the support of institutions capable of sustaining its needs. But not all houses enjoyed such stability. Mentmore Towers, despite its beauty and significance, remained mired in unresolved ownership issues and stalled redevelopment plans. Proposals for luxury hotels, private clubs, and event venues appeared over the years, each promising revitalization but collapsing under financial strain or bureaucratic entanglement. Without consistent oversight, the building continued to deteriorate, its once great central hall now vulnerable to the rain and frost that slipped through damaged roofing. While the world debated its potential future, the structure endured in silence, weathering another winter it was never designed to face alone. These contrasting trajectories highlighted a sobering reality. Saving a palace required not only vision and money, but also the willingness to reshape the estate's identity. Some restorations introduced modern amenities, elevators, concealed wiring, fire suppression systems that fundamentally altered the original architecture. Others accepted that preserving the entire estate was impossible, and instead focused on restoring select wings or facades while allowing the rest to evolve into new functions. Each project was an exercise in compromise, balancing historical fidelity with contemporary practicality. Yet through all the challenges, one question grew louder. Could these houses, built for an era of endless staff, low taxation, and aristocratic ritual, truly survive in a world driven by efficiency, mobility, and shifting cultural values? The answer depended on how society chose to interpret their significance. If the palaces were viewed merely as remnants of privilege, their future appeared bleak. But if they were understood as architectural witnesses, structures that had stood through revolutions, wars, and transformations, then their preservation became more than an act of nostalgia. It became a responsibility. For each estate still standing, the stakes extended beyond aesthetics. These buildings held fragments of European history within their walls. The evolution of craftsmanship, the interplay of politics and culture, the aspirations and anxieties of the people who built them. Losing such a house meant losing a chapter of civilization, one that could never be rewritten in glass and steel. In this light, the question of survival became less about practicality and more about choice. Could modern society recognize value beyond immediate utility? Could it invest not only in restoration, but in meaning? The future of the Rothschild palaces depended on whether people believed these structures were worth saving, not because they belonged to a wealthy family, but because they belonged to the broader story of human ambition. Ultimately, the palaces that endure will do so not through the force of their stone, but through the collective will to keep their stories alive. They are monuments to a world that once thrived, faltered, and transformed. They are reminders that grandeur is fleeting, yet cultural memory is enduring. And as long as even a single visitor walks through a restored hall or gazes up at a reconstructed facade, the houses will continue to fulfill their deepest purpose: to stand as silent witnesses to the civilizations that shape them and to the civilizations that follow.